Hello everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I've got the Smith Wesson M&P 22 Magnum sitting here on the table. Please don't forget to check out our website. Go to our affiliates page. You'll find discount codes for things like Mantis Axe and Core belts. Link to that cool little bore light that we use for lighting up the barrels. Use those links. It will often save you money, never will cost you any additional money, and helps the channel. And please consider supporting the channel on Player, formerly Utreon, where we can do some types of videos that are no longer allowed on YouTube. This is the latest in Smith & Wesson's M&P lineup, and it's chambered, as I mentioned, in 22 Magnum, and it holds 30 of them in this double stack magazine. And one of the things I did find with this magazine, and by the way, it comes with two, you can see the other one sitting right there, unlike the Kel-Tec PMR-30, which also holds 30 rounds, the magazine was easy to load. I didn't need to buy any 3D printed magazine loaders off the internet to successfully do it. It wasn't until probably the last two rounds that it got stiff at all. Before that, it actually loaded up pretty easy. So these magazines actually seem to work quite well. From a functioning perspective, it ran pretty good. We had two stoppages. With CCI ammo, the third round of the first mag, we had one failure to feed, so it kind of pinned itself up against the part of the feed ramp there, the bottom part of the feed ramp. And simply cycling the gun cleared it and it got running again. And then I had that near the end with the arms core ammo, had that similar thing. So the CCI is on the known good list. I'm going to write this off as break-in period because out of everything we shot, we only had those two stoppages at all. It ran very well beyond those two things, and both of them were easily cleared. The arms core ammo, a lot of 22 Magnum automatics won't run with, including for example, the Kel-Tec. It won't run with it. This ran it. Other than that one stoppage, it ran quite well. And getting the occasional stoppage with rimfire is not unusual. So I'm going to actually look at this so far as being pretty decent gun. Get past the break-in, make sure get some more rounds down the range, make sure it still works well. I'll show you a few of the features that are on it. As you can see, there's a thumb safety here at the back. It's also got an inertial toggle on the trigger, and it has the internal drop safety. So this should be a drop safe weapon. The slide step slide release is ambidextrous, and both sides do actually work, as well as the thumb safety. So lefty or righty, you get to enjoy this gun. You can see the plate here, it's optics ready. Now Smith & Wesson says that most popular micro red dots will directly mount right on it, and they don't specify which ones those are. By the way, the magazine release is reversible but not ambidextrous. They don't specify which ones they are. I wish these manufacturers would do kind of like Springfield did with the Echelon, where they actually gave a list, and not only did they give a list, but they also told how to set the pins up. So most micro red dots, most popular micro red dots, whatever that actually means, should direct mount on this without plates. It has a 4-slot Picatinny rail, so you have the ability to add lights and lasers. It has the kind of that sandpaper texture you see in a lot of the M&P lineup. It feels like sandpaper, but it's not abrasive like sandpaper. It doesn't hurt your hand. There's almost no noticeable recoil on 22 Magnum, so it stays right in your hand. Now you notice there are no replaceable back straps, so that feature didn't make it to this particular model. The magazine has a inset here to make it easier to get a hold of it, to pull it out if you need to, and it's also got texture in a couple places on it to make it easy to get a hold of and keep a hold of the magazine. The trigger is a flatty trigger, and the inertial toggle disappears quite nicely. I'm going to be careful not to actually pull the trigger because this is a rimfire, but it disappears quite nicely and the trigger pulls up. We did notice there's a little bit of grit on the trigger. My initial shooting of it, I didn't actually notice it. When Hammer fired it, he noticed it, so I went back and I fired it, kind of really paid attention to it, and close attention to it, and I could pick it up. I think it kind of disappears when you're firing in normal run. The trigger seemed to be pretty good. Now I'm going to demonstrate the trigger, but the problem I found is I can't get this to chamber my 22 LR snap caps. It is rimfire, so I can't just dry fire it. And I'm not going to hold that against it. It's not designed for 22 LR. I was kind of hoping I'd get them to chamber just to protect the firing pin, but I can't. So I've got some on order. When they get here, I'm going to film the trigger and cut it in. So I'm going to just set aside. My snap caps arrived, so now I'm ready to test the trigger. I've got one chambered. This is what they look like. They're just inert dummy rounds to protect the firing pin. Go ahead and insert the mag so I can cycle it. But let's start with the take-up. A little bit of grip, not bad during the take-up, relatively short take-up. Really nice, crisp, light brake. Short brake as well. It's got a nice trigger. So now I'm going to cycle it. It may act up. Nope, it actually chambered nicely. I wouldn't blame it if it had a problem with snap caps. A lot of guns do. There's the reset. A little bit of a bounce. It's a really short reset. I'm right back on the wall. And then a nice, short, crisp brake. Overall, this thing has a really nice trigger. The grit, I'm assuming, will go away with a few cyclings, but I don't think you'd be disappointed in the trigger on this. And now that, of course, you saw the trigger, I can continue on with the rest of it. It really doesn't have any serrations up at the front. There's kind of a little recess here that you can kind of catch, but there's nothing really up front to make it easy for doing a press check if that's what you want to do. But there are the classic fish scale at the back, which are really easy to get a hold of, and they kind of recess back in, and at the back end up kind of being like a wing. You can kind of see it a little bit there. So they're kind of beveled in, and as my thumb comes back, it hits that wing. So it's really easy to get a hold of the slide, and the slide is actually quite light, so it's easy to operate. I'm going to pop the magazine out of it, and you can see how easy it is to cycle the slide. Now, one thing that's interesting about this, there's no Zymac or aluminum or any other things, and all of the parts are either polymer for the frame or steel. The barrel is actually got a sleeve, but it's not your classic thin metal sleeve inside of a barrel. It's actually the piston. So when I get it apart, I'll be able to show you that piston assembly. The sights are bright fiber optic at the front, but it's a blackout rear, and I'm not a fan of blackout rears. But what I did find is there's enough of a gap here between the front and the rear at the back to pick up a little bit of the target. So despite the blackout rear sight, I was actually able to shoot it well. Both Hammer and I kind of hated the rear sight, but I was able to pull decent groups with it. Happily, they are replaceable, both front and rear, so if you don't like them, or of course you put a red dot on it and the whole problem goes away. They're dovetailed. So there's only two negatives I found on this gun so far. One negative is you do need a tool to take it down. That's a little bit annoying. You have to push this pin out, and you have to line up the notch. Well, lining up the notch is no different than something like a 1911, but I don't like having to use tools. However, a Glock disassembly tool works real well. And I've kind of mentioned this before. Even if you wouldn't touch a Glock, if it was the only thing on the shelf after the zombie apocalypse, you might want to pick up a Glock disassembly tool. They're well made. That punch will work on so many different things, and they're inexpensive. They usually tend to be under $10. So even if you don't like Glocks, don't want Glocks, get a Glock disassembly tool. And they look like this. It's just a plastic handle with a punch. Unlike a lot of punches, it's actually pretty good quality steel. So these are useful for pretty much everything. But to take it apart and make sure the magazine's out and make sure it's cleared, and what I need to do is line up that so that that little cutout is lined up, and you can kind of see it there. And then I'm just going to kind of clamp the slide, turn it over, and push this pin out. And as long as I did it right, which I may have to adjust a little bit, it's kind of hard to do it on the camera. Trying to do it for the camera is more difficult than just doing it for real, but it pops right out. So I now have it in my hand. Let off the tension a little bit, put this thing out of the way, and then it'll come right apart. So I'm going to set the slide aside for the moment, just talk about the frame. It's internal hammer fired. The hammer is back here. Nice robust rails, front and rear. And it really looks like any other firearm. It doesn't look like a locked breech blowback, because it's not. And there's the upper actuator for the drop safety, which when I show you the slide, I'll show you the drop safety piston. But overall, it's a well-constructed, not a lot going on in here. I'll set that aside, and now we'll talk about the slide. So the slide looks a lot like any other that you've seen. So it has a captive wafer guide rod and combo spring. The barrel I'm going to pull out. I'm going to set the barrel aside for the moment and talk about the rest of the slide. I said there was two negatives. One was the takedown, and the other one is that the drop safety plunger looks like it's nylon. I know they're trying to save weight. I kind of wish they would have saved weight somewhere else. But nylon is at least self-lubricating, so it should hopefully wear well. But I wouldn't have used nylon for a part like that inside the slide. I wish that had been actually steel like everything else. Other than that, it's well constructed, it's well put together, and it's got, you know, no real tool marks, chatter marks. It's well done. Kind of turn it where you can see it. So now let's talk about the barrel, because then back here is the cutout for the hammer to come into to hit the firing pin, which you can kind of see right there. That silver piece right in front of my fingernail is the firing pin, and that gets hit by the hammer. That's part of this rod, by the way, is part of the tensioner for the extractor. So the barrel, this is the unique part. You've seen a lot of weird looking rimfire barrels where there's something unique about them. This locks this outer housing in place. The pin, the takedown pin, goes through this hole right here and locks it in place. But the unique part of this is that this is actually a piston. If I hold the, I'll use the Galactus assembly tool, right here, there's a hole. That's a gas port. So when the bullet crosses the gas port, but not before, so when the bullet's back here, there's no gas pressure there, so the whole thing stays closed. The spring holds it closed. Once the bullet reaches this point, you'll start to get gas pressure in this piston area, and it will push, put this back together. Got to get it turned the right way. It will push this back, push against the breech face, and initiate the cycling. So it's a gas operated, but the gas piston is integral to this whole assembly. They call it the tempo barrel system. It did work. It worked well and it worked reliable. There is one caveat with it, and they make it clear in the ammo listing, is you need to use either fully jacketed or otherwise jacketed bullets. You can't use the plated ones or the bullet where the bullet is polymer. You can use the polymer tip ones like Hornady and things like that, but polymer bullets or copper plated bullets, what'll happen is the lead will end up getting in here and fouling the system up and start to interfere with it functioning correctly. So for clarity on that polymer thing, Hornady's have a little polymer tip on their nose, a little pointy piece of plastic. That's fine. Those will work fine. But there are companies that are starting to make polymer bullets where the whole bullet itself is polymer. Basically, it's a plastic bullet. That will bung this up, as well as copper plated. The plating will wear off and you'll get lead in here and it'll mess it up. It won't ruin it, but what it'll do is it'll interfere with the tolerances in here, make this start to stick, make the gun unreliable. So jacketed hollow point, full metal jacket, total metal jacket, they're fine. Total polymer bullets and copper plated bullets, you know, kind of a no-no if you want to be able to have a decently long range session, if I can get that out. Overall, this is an interesting barrel setup. It seems to be well machined, well done. I can show you the rifling. It's got nice rifling. It's conventional rifling, of course. It's well machined, no tool marks, no chatter marks. Overall, well done. And the feed ramp, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is polished. It's a short, small little feed ramp. That's not unusual. The bullets kind of feed almost straight in. The only problem is they do kind of start pointed down a little bit and catch on this. So if you get them loaded into the magazine wrong, they might hang up. And that may or may not be what happened to us with the 2 stoppages we did have. But overall, it proved to actually be pretty reliable beyond that. And I'm going to look at it as a break-in. I kind of give new guns a reasonable break-in period. And we only had those 2 stoppages, and they were both identical, where the round didn't feed. It hit the feed ramp and kind of stopped. Reassembly is probably just as easy as disassembly and very similar to what you're used to with other firearms. It drops into place. You take the captive recoil spring, put it up the front, give it a little shove to get it in front of the barrel block, and lock it in place. That's it. And I kind of make a note of this because most blowback guns, which most rimfires are blowback, whether they're Magnum or not, have really twitchy, weird pull over this and strange procedures for assembly and disassembly. Since this isn't blowback and it's got that integral piston, it goes to act together pretty much like anything else you're used to. Line it up. Well, this part here can get a little twitchy. That time it went really easy. Sometimes you have to fiddle with it to get it back. But now all I got to do is line that back up. This is really no different than a 1911. Take this takedown pin, put it in there. Now one thing I'm going to show you on the takedown pin, see that spline, if I can get the camera to focus, that spline, it looks like a gear right at the end here. That's going to seat into the takedown lever on the other, the slide stop slide release on the other side. And if you mess this up, it can ruin the whole thing. So you don't want to get forceful. If it doesn't want to go, figure out what you got wrong and do it right. So let me go ahead and try again. I'm going to drop that in place. See, make sure I've got this set in the right place. It should just kind of go back together fairly easy. If it doesn't, then I'm just going to wiggle it around till it does. That's it. Now here's where I would normally pull the trigger, but being rimfire, I'm not going to pull the trigger. But it goes back together pretty easy. And on this side, that's where that pin sits, right by the end of my fingernail. That pin sits, that extension of that pin sits in there and operates the slide stop slide release. So about the only thing that I would really change on this, and may, if I don't put a red dot on it, if you want to go shoot old school with iron sights, that blackout sight doesn't make it super easy, but at least it has that gap. And of course, you could just solve the entire problem by dropping a micro red dot on there if you can find one of the common popular ones that direct fits. Last thing I'll do is talk about some of the specs. I usually do that earlier, but I kind of overlooked it. It's 8.4 inches long front to back. It's 5.9 inches tall with the flush magazine in it, which is the only magazine available, is the flush magazine. And it's 1.13 inches wide. So it's not a very thick gun, and of course that magazine holds 30 rounds, but it's a full-size gun. And it weighs 24 ounces, 2 ounces of which is the magazine that I just inserted. And from an overall sights perspective, it's very similar in size to the 5.7 that they recently released. In fact, the styling is very similar. It looks very similar. This particular 5.7 doesn't have a manual safety. But you see, overall, they're very similar in looks, design, style. If you didn't catch that threaded barrel on the front, you might not be able to quickly tell the two apart, other than, of course, the roll mark on them. With an MSRP of $649, it's got a lot of potential. Beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, click that bell if you do to be notified when we put out a new video. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Rumble, Player, and Patreon. Thank you.
Don't say I think that.